Mr. Boyle. Mr. Brabenek. No. Mr. Braunstein. Yes. Mr. Brennan. Yes. Mr. Breslin. Yes. Mr. Brindisi. Yes. Mr. Bronson. Yes. Mr. Buchwald. Yes. Mr. Butler. No. Mr. Cahill. Yes. Mr. Carlucci. Yes. Mr. Soretto. Yes. Mr. Colton. Yes. Mr. Comrie. Yes. Mrs. Cook. Yes. Ms. Corwin. No. Mr. Crespo. Yes. Mr. Croce. Mr. Crouch. No. Mr. Curran. No. Mr. Cusick. Yes. Mr. Simbrowitz. Yes. Ms. Davila. Mr. DeFrancisco. Mr. Dendecker. Yes. Mr. Diaz. Mr. Eric Delon. Yes. Mr. Martin Delon. Yes. Mr. Dinowitz. Mr. DiPietro. I'm sorry? Mr. DiPietro. Mrs. Dupree. Mr. Engelbright. Yes. Mr. Espaillat. Yes. Ms. Fahey. Mr. Farley. No. Mr. Farrell. Yes. Mr. Felder. Mr. Finch. Mr. Fitzpatrick. No. Mr. Flanagan. Mr. Friend. Mr. Funke. Mrs. Galiff. Yes. Mr. Gallivan. Mr. Gant. Yes. Mr. Garbarino. No. Mr. Gianaris. Yes. Mr. Giglio. No. Mr. Jonai. Ms. Glick. Mr. Golden. Mr. Goldfeder. Yes. Mr. Goodell. Yes. Mr. Gottfried. Mr. Graff. No. Mr. Griffo. Mrs. Gunther. Yes. Mr. Hamilton. Yes. Mr. Hannon. Ms. Harris. Yes. Ms. Hassel-Thompson. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hasty. Yes. Mr. Hevesy. Yes. Mr. Heikind. Yes. Ms. Hooper. Yes. Mr. Hoyleman. Yes. Ms. Hunter. Yes. Ms. Heineman. Yes. Ms. Jaffe. Yes. Ms. Jean-Pierre. Yes. Mr. Johns. Ms. Joyner. Yes. Mr. Kaminsky. Mr. Katz. No. Mr. Kavanaugh. Yes. Mr. Kearns. Yes. Mr. Kennedy. Shh. Mr. Kim. Yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Kolb. No. Ms. Kruger. Yes. Mr. Lawler. No. Mr. Lanza. Mr. Larkin. Mr. Latimer. Yes. Mr. Laval. Mr. Levine. Yes. Mr. Lawrence. No. Mr. Lenthal. Yes. Ms. Lifton. Yes. Mr. Linares. Yes. Ms. Little. Mr. Lopez. Ms. Lupardo. Yes. Mr. Lupinacci. No. Mr. McGee. Yes. Mr. Magnarelli. Yes. Mr. Marcelino. Ms. Marchione. Mrs. Markey. Yes. Mr. Martins. Mrs. Mayer. Yes. Mr. McDonald. Yes. Mr. McDonough. No. Mr. McKevitt. No. Mr. McLaughlin. Mr. Miller. Yes. Mr. Montesano. No. Ms. Montgomery. Yes. Mr. Morelli. Yes. Mr. Mosley. Mr. Moya. Yes. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murray. No. Mr. Noje. Ms. Nolan. Yes. Mr. Nozzolio. Mr. Oakes. Mr. O'Donnell. Yes. Mr. O'Mara. Mr. Ortiz. Mr. Ort. Mr. Otis. Yes. Mr. Palmisano. No. Mr. Palumbo. No. Mr. Panapinto. Mr. Parker. Yes. Ms. Paulin. Yes. Mrs. Peoples-Stokes. Yes. Mr. Peralta. Mr. Perkins. Yes. Mr. Perry. Yes. Ms. Prasad. Yes. Mr. Pichardo. Yes. Mr. Pretlow. Yes. Mr. Court. Yes. Mr. Ra. No. Mr. Rea. No. Mr. Ranzenhofer. Ms. Richardson. Yes. Ms. Ritchie. Mr. Gustavo Rivera. Yes. Mr. Jose Rivera. Yes. Mr. Robach. Mrs. Robinson. Yes. Mr. Rodriguez. Ms. Rosenthal. Ms. Rosick. Yes. Ms. Russell. Yes. Mr. Ryan. Yes. Mr. Saladino. No. Mr. Sanders. Yes. Mr. Santa Barbara. Ms. Savino. Ms. Schimmel. Yes. Mr. Schimminger. Ms. Seawright. Yes. Mr. Sepulveda. Yes. Ms. Serino. Mr. Serrano. Yes. Mr. Seward. Mr. Simanowitz. Yes. Ms. Simon. Ms. Simotas. Yes. Mr. Scartados. Yes. Mr. Skoufis. Yes. Ms. Solage. Yes. Mr. Squadron. Yes. Ms. Stavitsky. Yes. Mr. Daniel Steck. Mr. Philip Steck. Yes. Ms. Stewart Cousins. Yes. Mr. Sturpey. Yes. Mr. Tedisco. No. Ms. Tenney. No. Mr. Thiel. Yes. Mr. Titone. Yes. Ms. Titus. Yes. Mr. Valesky. Yes. Mr. Venditto. Ms. Walker. Yes. Mr. Walter. No. Ms. Weinstein. Yes. Mr. Weprin. Yes. Ms. Warner. Yes. Ms. Wozniak. No. Mr. Wright. Ms. Young. Mr. Zabrowski. Yes. Mr. Abenanti. Yes. Mr. Akshar. Mr. Amador.
The chair announces that Nan Mead has received sufficient number of votes to be elected as a regent of the University of the State of New York from Judicial District 1. A quorum of all members of the New York State Legislature being present and voting by joint ballot, and Nan Eileen Mead having received the majority of the votes of the whole number of such members, the chair declares that Nan Eileen Mead has been duly elected regent of the University of the State of New York from the 1st Judicial District for a term commencing immediately and expiring on March 31st, 2017. Congratulations. Nominations to elect a regent from the 5th Judicial District are now in order. The chair recognizes Assemblymember Magnarelli. Quiet in the chamber, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to nominate Elizabeth Smith Hackinson for a 5-year term as regent for the 5th Judicial District. Elizabeth's love of learning came from her parents, who were survivors of the Great Depression and deeply valued education and always asked for her best. Edward, her father, was a longtime professor at Syracuse University, and her mother, Mary, who I had the privilege of knowing, and who passed away at the age of 106, was Syracuse University's first counselor for continuing education for women at its university college. Learning was not about a score or reward. What mattered the most was what you did with that learning. Elizabeth received her bachelor's degree in arts and sciences and education social studies from Syracuse University. She also received her master's degree in student personnel administration and higher education from Syracuse University. Finally, she holds a certificate in advanced studies in instruction administration from the State University of New York at Oswego. Elizabeth is and always has been a forward-thinking educator. She brings 32 years of experience to the Board of Regents. She has worked with learners from preschool to adulthood. Elizabeth brings excellent mediation and relationship skills to the board with the ability to inspire others to outperform expectations. She has a proven record of designing, implementing, and enhancing educational programming that is multicultural and involves diverse curricula. Her experiences also include being a Fulbright scholar, not once, but twice, and she has been a member of the panel that selects such scholars. Elizabeth knows the unique challenges our upstate schools face. She was an educator for many years in the Syracuse City School District. This experience will make her a valuable asset to the Board of Regents. Additionally, she has years of experience working in higher education that will help her confront the unique issues facing higher education in New York. I personally have known Liz, as I call her, for quite some time, and I consider her a friend. I've been surrounded by teachers all my life. My wife, Karen, is a teacher. My son is a teacher, as well as a brother and a sister. I have a daughter-in-law and a son-in-law who are teachers. From them, I not only learn about the state of education in our schools, but also learn of those who stand out in their professions. Liz is one of those standouts. In closing, Elizabeth Hackinson brings the required education, experience, and temperament needed to fill a seat on the New York State Board of Regents. Her unique skill set will allow her to navigate the serious challenges our state education system faces and will help lead us to better outcomes. Therefore, I proudly place Elizabeth Smith Hackinson's name in nomination to serve as regent for the 5th Judicial District. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For the purpose of seconding the nomination, the chair recognizes Senator Valesky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a real honor and a privilege for me to be here today to second the nomination of Liz Hackinson as a member of the Board of Regents from the 5th Judicial District. And I'm so pleased to join my colleague and friend, close friend, Assemblyman Magnarelli from Syracuse in doing so. Those of you who have taken the time and to look through the resume and the supporting materials that Ms. Hackinson has submitted throughout this process will quickly see and realize and understand that this is someone who is eminently qualified for this role, eminently qualified for this role. She has a lifetime of experience working in so many different capacities in the educational system. The one I think, from my perspective, that is probably the most significant and most important, the almost 32 years that she spent in a classroom, both at the high school level and the middle school level, in the city of Syracuse public school system. Yeah. And all of the challenges that come with a career in public schools, particularly in urban education, and those of you who represent the big 5 school districts, I'm sure know exactly what I'm referring to. It is a difficult job, and I'm sure a difficult career in many ways, but one I'm sure that she would say was incredibly rewarding, personally rewarding. The difference that she made in the lives of so many young people over all of those years, we thank her very, very much for that dedication. And it would certainly be, I'm sure, easy to enjoy retirement and to leave it to someone else to take on the difficult work and the challenges that the Board of Regents and a seat on the Board of Regents brings. But she has determined and come very, very willing to continue her career and to continue her service and to continue to give back to the people, in this case, of the 5th Judicial District. So I am so proud that she has put herself forward, and am looking forward to working very, very closely with her over her term on the Board of Regents, because the decisions that she will help make and the choices that she will help define will really set education and public education on a new course going forward here in the state of New York. So again, Mr. Speaker, delighted to be here and delighted to speak on behalf and seconding the nomination of Elizabeth Hackinson as a member of the Board of Regents from the 5th Judicial District. Thank you.
For the purposes of a seconding of the nomination of Elizabeth Hackinson, the chair recognizes Assemblymember Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of Elizabeth Hackinson to become the next regent from the 5th Judicial District. She is a Central New York native and a graduate of Nottingham High School in my district. She has spent her life and career working in schools, so I know she will have no trouble fulfilling her commitment to be present for teachers and parents in every part of the 5th District. Mr. Speaker, all of us in this chamber today know that there are many challenges when it comes to educating our children, but those difficulties are mirrored by Ms. Hackinson's diverse set of experiences. From Head Start and early childhood education to college readiness, there is hardly an area of education in this state that she has not touched. I know that she will go on to serve with distinction, and for that reason, she has my support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any other nominations? The chair recognizes Assemblymember Barclay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor and pleasure to nominate John Sheffield for the 5th Judicial District Board of Regents. Mr. Sheffield lives in our colleague's district, Bob Oaks, and he teaches math at the Central Square Middle School, which is in my district. Mr. Sheffield has a Master of Education that he got from SUNY Oswego in 1995 and a Bachelor of Arts that he got from SUNY Oswego in 1987. And he's been a teacher since 1989, and his experience with public school students has ranged from the typical classroom setting, Mr. Speaker, to inclusion situations, to special education and co-teaching, and to small group academic intervention. As you can see from his experience, Mr. Sheffield has a wide breadth of classroom experience, which will serve him very well on the Board of Regents. In addition, anyone in the Central New York area who follows education knows that Mr. Sheffield is very active, speaking out on public education issues. He regularly addresses boards of education and parent and community groups, and he's written numerous essays, papers, and articles on public education. Mr. Speaker, I believe in the last few years, if anything we've been taught over the last few years, is that in the field of public education, it's that we need more teachers, those who are on the front lines educating our children in policy and leadership positions. I'm confident that Mr. Sheffield has the experience and characteristics that would make him an excellent addition to the Board of Regents. And accordingly, Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to nominate him for the position of the 5th Judicial District Board of Regents position. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For the purposes of seconding the nomination of John Sheffield, the chair recognizes Assemblymember Tenney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the Education Committee and also as a resident of the 5th Judicial District, it's with great pleasure that I second the nomination of John Sheffield. Mr. Sheffield is exactly the type of person that we need as a regent. He's a beloved teacher. He's a tireless advocate for our students. He's also a former probation officer handling juvenile issues, so he's spent a lot of time counseling and working with students. One thing about Mr. Sheffield that you will undeniably know if you meet him is that he is passionate, he's energetic, and he's inspiring. And if anyone saw his interview before the board or before the Education Committee, you will be rushing to the chambers to try to vote for Mr. Sheffield. And for those reasons, and also his excellent resume and his history of teaching our students and advocating for them, I highly recommend the vote for Mr. John Sheffield as the regent in the 5th Judicial District. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any other nominations? Being none, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Abadi. Ms. Hackinson. Mr. Abenanti. Mr. Adabo. Ms. Hackinson. Mr. Akshar. Mr. Amador. Mrs. Arroyo. The complete name: Elizabeth Hackinson, John Sheffield. Mrs. Arroyo, Ms. Hackinson. Mr. Aubrey, Ms. Hackinson. Mr. Avella, Hackinson. Mr. Barclay, Mr. Sheffield. Mrs. Barrett, Hackinson. Mr. Barron, Hackinson. Mr. Benedetto.
You can't even make this up.
Mr. Benedetto. Hackinson. Ms. Bichat. Hackinson. Mr. Blake. Hackinson. Mr. Blankenbush. Mr. Sheffield. Mr. Bonasek. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Brabenek. Sheffield. Mr. Braunstein. Hackinson. Mr. Brennan. Hackinson. Mr. Breslin. Thought I heard him. Mr. Brindisi. Mr. Breslin. Ms. Hackinson. Mr. Brindisi. Hackinson. Mr. Bronson. Hackinson. Mr. Buchwald. Hackinson. Mr. Butler. Sheffield. Mr. Cahill. Hackinson. Mr. Carlucci. Hackinson. Mr. Soretto. Hackinson. Mr. Colton. Hackinson. Mr. Comrie. Hackinson. Mrs. Cook. Hackinson. Ms. Corwin. Sheffield. Mr. Crespo. Hackinson. Mr. Croce. Mr. Crouch. Mr. Curran. Sheffield. Mr. Cusick. Mr. Simbrowitz. Ms. Davila. Mr. DeFrancisco. Mr. Den Decker. Hackinson. Mr. Diaz. Mr. Eric Delon. Hackinson. Mr. Martin Delon. Hackinson. Mr. Dinowitz. Mr. DiPietro. Mrs. Dupree. Sheffield. Mr. Engelbright. Hackinson. Mr. Espaillat. Hackinson. Ms. Fahey. Hackinson. Mr. Farley. Mr. Farrell. Hackinson. Mr. Felder. Mr. Finch. Sheffield. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Sheffield. Mr. Flanagan. Mr. Friend. Sheffield. Mr. Funke. Mrs. Galiff. Hackinson. Mr. Gallivan. Mr. Gant. Hackinson. Mr. Garbarino. Sheffield. Mr. Gianaris. Hackinson. Mr. Giglio. Sheffield. Mr. Jonai. Hackinson. Ms. Glick. Hackinson. Mr. Golden. Mr. Goldfeder. Hackinson. Mr. Goodell. Sheffield. Mr. Gottfried. Mr. Graff. Sheffield. Mr. Griffo. Mrs. Gunther. Hackinson. Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hannon. Ms. Harris. Hackinson. Ms. Hassel-Thompson. Hackinson. Mr. Hawley. Sheffield. Mr. Hasty. Mr. Hevesy. Hackinson. Mr. Heikind. Ms. Hooper. Ms. Hackinson. Ms. Hooper. Hackinson. Mr. Hoyleman. Hackinson. Ms. Hunter. Hackinson. Ms. Heineman. Hackinson. Ms. Jaffe. Ms. Jean-Pierre. Hackinson. Mr. Johns. Sheffield. Ms. Joyner. Hackinson. Mr. Kaminsky. Mr. Katz. Mr. Kavanaugh. Hackinson. Mr. Kearns. Hackinson. Mr. Kennedy. Hackinson. Mr. Kim. Hackinson. Mr. Klein. Mr. Kolb. Ms. Sheffield. Ms. Kruger. Hackinson. Mr. Lawler. Mr. Lanza. Mr. Larkin. Mr. Latimer. Sheffield. Mr. Laval. Mr. Levine. Hackinson. Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence. Thank you, Ms. Sheffield. Mr. Lenthal. Hackinson. Ms. Lifton. Hackinson. Mr. Linares. Hackinson. Ms. Little. Mr. Lopez. Sheffield. Ms. Lepardo. Hackinson. Mr. Lupinacci. Sheffield. Mr. McGee. Mr. McGee. Hackinson. Mr. Magnarelli. Hackinson. Mr. Marcelino. Ms. Marchione. Mrs. Markey. Hackinson. Mr. Martins. Mrs. Mayer. Hackinson. Mr. McDonald. Hackinson. Mr. McDonough. Sheffield. Mr. McKevitt. Sheffield. Mr. McLaughlin. Sheffield. Mr. Miller. Hackinson. Mr. Montesano. Sheffield. Ms. Montgomery. Hackinson. Mr. Morelli. Hackinson. Mr. Mosley. Hackinson. Mr. Moya. Hackinson. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murray. Sheffield. Mr. Noje. Ms. Nolan. Hackinson. Mr. Nozzolio. Mr. Oakes. Mr. O'Donnell. Hackinson. Mr. O'Mara. Mr. Ortiz. Mr. Ort. Mr. Otis. Hackinson. Mr. Palmisano. Sheffield. Mr. Palumbo. Sheffield. Mr. Penapinto. Mr. Parker. Ms. Paulin. Mr. Parker is Ms. Hackinson. Ms. Paulin. Hackinson. Mrs. Peoples-Stokes. Hackinson. Mr. Peralta. Mr. Perkins. Hackinson. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry. Hackinson. Ms. Prasad. Hackinson. Mr. Pichardo. Hackinson. Mr. Pretlow. Hackinson. Mr. Court. Hackinson. Mr. Ra. Sheffield. Mr. Rea. Sheffield. Mr. Ramos. Hackinson. Mr. Ranzenhofer. Ms. Richardson. Hackinson. Ms. Ritchie. Mr. Gustavo Rivera. Hackinson. Mr. Jose Rivera. Hackinson. Mr. Robach. Mrs. Robinson. Hackinson. Mr. Rodriguez. Hackinson. Ms. Rosenthal. Hackinson. Ms. Rosick. Ms. Russell. Hackinson. Mr. Ryan. Hackinson. Mr. Saladino. Sheffield. Mr. Sanders. Hackinson. Mr. Santa Barbara. Hackinson. Ms. Savino. Ms. Schimmel. Hackinson. Mr. Schimminger. Hackinson. Ms. Seawright. Hackinson. Mr. Sepulveda. Hackinson. Ms. Sereno. Mr. Serrano. Hackinson. Mr. Seward. Mr. Simanowitz. Ms. Simon. Hackinson. Ms. Simotas. Hackinson. Mr. Scartatos. Hackinson. Mr. Skoufis. Hackinson. Ms. Solage. Hackinson. Mr. Squadron. Hackinson. Ms. Stavitsky. Hackinson. Mr. Daniel Steck. Sheffield. Mr. Philip Steck. Hackinson. Ms. Stewart Cousins. Mr. Sturpey. Hackinson. Mr. Tedisco. Sheffield. Ms. Tenney. Sheffield. Mr. Thiel. Hackinson. Mr. Titone. Hackinson. Ms. Titus. Hackinson. Mr. Valesky. Hackinson. Mr. Venditto. Ms. Walker. Hackinson. Mr. Walter. Sheffield. Ms. Weinstein. Mr. Weprin. Ms. Warner. Hackinson. Ms. Wozniak. Sheffield. Mr. Wright. Ms. Young. Mr. Zabrowski. Hackinson.